Have you ever opened one of your mother's old books and found a letter that wasn't meant for you? A letter calling you by a name you've never heard, written to a child who either died or was never supposed to exist? What if the woman you called mom your entire life wasn't your mother at all? This is the story of a family secret buried for over 30 years and one woman's journey to uncover the truth about who she really is. If you love emotional, mysterious stories, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers today. The house smelled like lemon oil in memory, like something both freshly cleaned and permanently stained by the weight of a life once lived. Emma Price stood in the middle of her late mother's study, surrounded by silence and the muffled sounds of cardboard boxes being shuffled in the hallway. She had returned to her childhood home to pack it up, to close a chapter she didn't remember volunteering to finish, and yet, here she was, 45, recently divorced, and folding grief into piles like sweaters. The bookcase in the corner had always fascinated her as a child. Its shelves bowed slightly under the weight of old paperbacks, gardening manuals, and well-thumbed cookbooks. Her mother, Catherine, used to say it came from her own mother's house, but something about it had never felt like it belonged. The wood didn't match the rest of the furniture. The carvings were more ornate, older, delicate in a way that didn't fit the clean lines of the rest of the room. Emma crouched beside it, running her fingers along the spines of books she hadn't seen in decades. One slipped free when she touched it, a faded hardcover novel, Rebecca, by Daphne du Maurier. It had belonged to her mother, she was sure of that, but when she opened it, a thin, folded letter fluttered out and landed softly on the rug. It was yellowed, the paper soft with age but not brittle. Her name wasn't on it. In fact, it wasn't addressed to her at all. To Lillian, my daughter. Emma stared at the name for several seconds. It struck something deep, old and buried. Lillian was the name of her mother's older daughter, her sister, who died as a child. At least that was what she'd always been told. A vague tragedy. A fall down the stairs story. A photograph that had sat dusty on the mantel but had never been moved to a frame. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. I failed you, just like I failed her. I raised the wrong child in the right body. I thought I could erase the past, but all I did was bury it deeper. If you ever read this, then I didn't protect you the way I promised. Forgive me. No signature, no date, just those sentences. Emma's breath caught. The wrong child? Raised? What did that mean? She read the letter again, slower this time. The words didn't sound like something her mother would write. Not the Catherine she knew, who baked perfect pies, made tight lists, and never left dishes in the sink overnight. Catherine didn't believe in mess, and this letter was emotional chaos. Emma sat back on her heels, the letter in one hand, the book in the other. Her heart pounded as she stared at the words again. I raised the wrong child in the right body. The room seemed to tilt ever so slightly. She remembered now, once, maybe when she was 9 or 10, she'd heard a woman at church whisper, "That one's the second chance, poor thing." And another voice, perhaps the pastor's wife, had replied, "Catherine's been through enough. We don't question how she chooses to heal." Back then it hadn't made sense. It didn't even feel like it was about her, but now it echoed. Emma stood slowly and went back to the bookcase. She started pulling out books, one after another, checking inside each one. A gardening guide, a romance novel, a volume of poetry. Then, tucked into a photo album behind a stack of recipe cards, she found something else. A small black and white photograph with scalloped edges. 3 figures. A woman, a young girl, and another woman, heavily pregnant. The young girl looked vaguely familiar. The older woman, that was Catherine, younger, softer around the eyes, but unmistakable. But the pregnant woman, Emma didn't recognize her. And yet, there was something about the shape of her face, the angle of her eyes. It felt like looking into a distorted mirror. No names, no date, just another mystery. Emma walked out of the study, the photo and letter in hand, and stood in the hallway where the morning light poured in through the front windows. She could hear her aunt, her mother's sister, talking to the movers outside. Emma stepped onto the porch. "Aunt Joan?" she asked. Joan turned, her smile polite, strained. She was in her 70s now, slower than she used to be, but still sharp. "Yes, sweetheart?" Emma held up the letter. "Did my mother ever write to Lillian?" Joan stiffened, just slightly. Her eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Emma's face. "Where did you find that?" "In a book, in the old study." Joan's lips pressed together. "That was a long time ago. Some things are best left buried." Emma stepped forward. "Was she talking about me in this letter?" Joan looked away. "You should finish packing. The house is almost ready to be listed." Emma's voice dropped. "Aunt Joan, am I Lillian?" That made the older woman flinch, just for a second. "No," she said firmly. "You're not Lillian, and she's gone. That's all you need to know." But Emma wasn't convinced, not anymore. Because if she wasn't Lillian, then who was she? The photograph didn't leave Emma's hand for the rest of that day. She carried it from room to room, unsure whether she was searching for more clues or simply unable to set it down. 3 women, 1 familiar, 1 mysterious, 1 little girl whose name haunted the edges of memory like the final note of a song she could never quite recall. The pregnant woman in the photo stared directly at the camera, her hands resting on her belly in quiet pride. She looked maybe 22, maybe younger. Her dark hair curled naturally around her shoulders, and her eyes, God, her eyes, were wide and sad, even through the grainy black and white lens. Emma couldn't explain it, but there was something in the shape of that face, the curve of that jawline, that felt eerily, painfully familiar. She took the photo and letter to her car that evening, unable to leave them behind in the house that now felt increasingly foreign. That night, in the small apartment she'd rented near her old high school, Emma barely slept. The ceiling fan spun above her bed like a slow whisper. Around 3 a.m. she sat up, turned on the lamp, and retrieved an old family photo album her mother used to keep in the guest room closet. Page after page passed. Vacations, holidays, birthdays, but the woman in the black and white photo never appeared again. It was as if she existed only in that single moment, captured and erased in the same breath. The next morning, Emma drove across town to the assisted living facility where Aunt Joan had moved several years earlier. Joan sat on the patio with a crocheted blanket over her knees, sipping tea and feeding sparrows, breadcrumbs like they were old friends. Emma didn't bother with pleasantries. She sat beside her and held out the photograph. "Who is she?" Joan's hand stopped midair. A single breadcrumb fell, untouched. She glanced at the image for no more than a second. "I told you," she said softly, "some things should be left alone." "I can't leave it alone," Emma replied. "This photo, this letter, they were hidden." Joan sighed and leaned back, her eyes following the birds instead of Emma. "Her name was Margaret, your mother's younger sister. She got pregnant when she was 19. It was scandalous then. No husband, no job. Catherine tried to help, but their mother, your grandmother, was furious. Things fell apart fast." Emma blinked. "You're telling me my mother had a sister? I never heard of Margaret." Joan smiled sadly. "You wouldn't have. Catherine stopped saying her name after the accident." Emma's heart thudded. "What accident?" Joan hesitated. "Margaret died in 1990, fell down a flight of stairs. They said it was an accident. She was 7 months pregnant." Emma felt like the air had thickened. "And the baby?" Joan didn't answer, just stared off into the distance like she was counting clouds instead of memories. Emma leaned forward. "Was the baby me?" Joan flinched, a tiny movement, almost imperceptible, but Emma saw it. "Tell me the truth," she whispered. Please. Joan's voice was thin when it finally came. Your birth certificate says Catherine is your mother. That's the only truth I can legally speak. But not the emotional truth, Emma pressed. Not the actual truth. Joan stood up slowly, brushing breadcrumbs off her lap. You're not ready for what that truth costs. She turned and walked toward the facility doors without another word. Emma drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls. Only her thoughts, swirling like storm clouds that refused to rain. She pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for over an hour, staring at the dashboard, trying to breathe through a growing ache in her chest that had no name yet. At night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crept into her mind like a whisper. If Margaret was my mother, then Catherine wasn't just my mom. She was the keeper of someone else's child. The next morning, Emma opened her laptop and began searching public records, obituaries, hospital archives, birth announcements from 1990. It was slow, tedious work, but in one corner of the internet, she found it. A short article from a small local paper. Margaret Davis, 23, dies after fall at family residence, survived by sister Catherine Bennett. Family declines to comment on pregnancy rumors. Beneath it, a scanned image of a funeral card. And at the very bottom, a link, long broken but still legible in cache data, to a scanned document titled Infant Birth Registration, Eleanor Margaret Davis. Emma's mouth went dry. Her name had never been Eleanor, or so she thought. She clicked the document, heart pounding. It loaded slowly. The mother's name, Margaret Davis. Father, unknown. Date, March 6, 1990. Time of birth, 3:41 a.m. Emma stared at the screen. Her own birthday. The letter, the photo, the silence. None of it had been random. Her life, as she knew it, had started with a lie. And now the truth was knocking. The envelope arrived 2 days later, thick and yellowed with time, addressed in slanted handwriting to Miss Eleanor M. Davis, care of Emma Price. It had no return address, no postage stamp, no markings beyond the faint ink, and a single wax seal that had cracked along the edges. Inside was a letter folded with care, the paper old but intact. Emma's hands trembled as she opened it, knowing before reading the first word that this would change everything. If you're reading this, then someone finally told you what they should have said years ago. My name is Charles R. Davis. I am your father. The words hit her like a memory she never had but always carried somewhere in her bones. She sat down at her kitchen table, the room spinning gently around her as she continued. Your mother, Margaret, and I were never married. We were young, scared, and the world wasn't ready to forgive mistakes made by girls without rings. When she died, I begged your grandmother to let me raise you. She refused, said you were better off with Catherine, that you'd forget everything. But I never did. I've followed your life in silence. I know your name now, Emma. I know who you've become. And I'm sorry I wasn't there. The signature at the bottom was shaky, but unmistakable. Beneath it was a small photo, black and white, curled at the corners, of a man holding a newborn in a hospital blanket. The man's face was half-shadowed, but the look in his eyes said everything. Emma pressed her fingers to the paper. Her throat ached with unshed tears. She had grown up believing her life was a fixed line. Catherine as her mother, her father long gone or never known. No questions, no pieces missing. But now every thread of that story was unraveling into something far more fragile and human. Later that afternoon, she returned to the family house one last time. The movers had finished their job. Only silence remained, hanging thick in the air like dust. She walked through each room slowly, touching the edges of furniture, door frames, wallpaper faded from sun and time. In the upstairs hallway, she stopped at the old linen closet, remembering something Aunt Joan once mumbled in her sleep during a nap when Emma was 13. That poor girl fell. They all fell, really. Emma opened the closet and reached toward the back, behind the towels, behind the box of holiday napkins, until her hand landed on something hard, wooden, flat, and cold. She pulled it out, a slim plastic cassette tape in a labeled case. March 5, 1990, answering machine, 7:03 p.m. She stared at it, her heart beat like a warning drum. Upstairs, in her old bedroom closet, she knew exactly where her childhood tape recorder still sat, boxed and forgotten. Minutes later, she pressed play. The hiss of blank tape, then a beep, a voice, young, tired, trembling. "Mom, it's Margaret. Please pick up. I can't do this anymore. Lillian's not..." There was a crash, a thud, a scream in the distance, then silence, a long, ringing, awful silence before the line went dead. Emma pressed stop. Her hands were shaking again. Lillian. That name again. The sister she never knew. The girl who had supposedly died after an accident, a tragic fall. But what if Lillian hadn't just died? What if she had caused something? Emma ran to the garage, digging through old boxes until she found what she was looking for, an archived folder labeled 1990 Margaret, written in her grandmother's handwriting. Inside was a coroner's report. Accident, fall from staircase. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Status, pregnant fetal death confirmed. No foul play suspected. But then she flipped to the back. An attached note, in different handwriting, a police officer's memo. Per witness statement from minor Lillian Bennett, age 7, the deceased fell after verbal altercation. Child was present at time of incident. Emma dropped the folder. Her knees buckled as she sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by the ghosts of a family that had never told the full truth. So Lillian had been there. Lillian had witnessed, or maybe caused, Margaret's fall. And within days, Lillian was dead too. Emma pulled out the final document from the folder, a copy of Lillian's death certificate. Date, March 9, 1990. Cause, head trauma from fall. Circumstances, undetermined. No autopsy, no further investigation. Closed quietly, with a burial held 2 days later. Emma leaned back against the wall, the cold seeping into her spine. The timeline was too tight. Margaret died March 5th. Emma, born March 6. Lillian died March 9. 3 days, 3 deaths, 1 birth. Her birth. She now understood why no one wanted to speak of that week. Because it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a choice. The house on Sycamore Street hadn't changed much in 30 years. The paint had faded, the rose bushes gone wild, but the front porch still creaked in the same rhythm Emma imagined it had when Margaret walked across it carrying groceries and secrets. The address had been listed on an old insurance form tucked into the back of the police folder. Under former residence of Margaret Davis. Emma parked across the street, heart pounding, watching the wind shift the curtains in the upstairs window like the house was still breathing. She knocked 3 times. The woman who answered looked to be in her late 70s, with soft eyes and a gentle limp. "Yes?" she asked, not unkindly. Emma offered a smile. "My name is Emma. I think I lived here once. In 1990, briefly." The woman blinked, studied her for a moment longer, then opened the door wider. "Oh my Lord," she whispered. "Ellie?" Emma's breath caught. "You knew me?" The woman nodded slowly. "I used to watch you. I lived next door. Your mama, well, Margaret didn't trust many people, but she let me babysit when she had night shifts." Emma stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her like they recognized her weight. The living room was small, filled with floral prints and decades of lived-in comfort. On the mantel, framed photos of grandchildren stood beside a dusty porcelain angel. "She always called you Ellie," the woman said, easing into her recliner. "Short for Eleanor. You were such a quiet baby, never cried much, just stared with those big eyes like you already knew too much. Emma sat on the edge of the couch, gripping her hands. Do you remember what happened? When Margaret died? The woman's expression darkened. I wasn't there that day, just heard the ambulance. But I saw Lillian the day before. Something wasn't right. She was quiet, too, but in a scared way. Emma swallowed hard. Do you think she pushed Margaret? A pause. I think children carry pain in strange ways, and I think nobody ever helped that little girl carry hers. They sat in silence for a long moment, the ticking clock on the wall counting the years that had gone unspoken. She died 3 days later, Emma said softly. Lillian, I mean. I know, the woman replied. There were whispers. People said she fell too, but some folks think she jumped. Emma's eyes stung. And then I was gone. The woman nodded. Catherine came to collect you. I remember her standing on that porch, stone-faced. She said she was taking you somewhere safe, that you'd be raised right. Nobody questioned her. After 2 deaths in 1 week, people stopped asking questions altogether. Emma looked around the room, trying to imagine herself crawling on that carpet, babbling near that window, sleeping in one of those small bedrooms without knowing the world had shattered around her. She wasn't just adopted, she was erased, rewritten, rebranded for the sake of someone else's shame. That evening, back at the old family house, she opened the last drawer of Catherine's bedroom dresser. It stuck halfway, swollen from humidity, but she yanked until it gave. Inside, beneath scarves and lavender sachets, was a thick manila envelope, labeled, For Eleanor. When she's ready. Her hands trembled. Inside was a handwritten letter, not like the one she'd found in the book. This one was longer, neater, full of the kind of truth that tasted like metal on the tongue. I wasn't supposed to raise you. I wasn't strong enough. But I loved Margaret, and I couldn't let the world take another child from her. Your grandmother wanted to put you in foster care, said the whole family was cursed, but I couldn't stand the thought of you disappearing too. So, I changed your name, moved us far, started over, and every time I looked at you, I saw Margaret smile, but I also saw the fall, the blood, the silence. And I didn't know how to be a mother after that. Emma's tears fell silently. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I kept thinking I would. But time passed, and every year it got harder to undo what had been done. You weren't a replacement. You were a gift, even if I received you in the wreckage of someone else's life. At the bottom of the envelope was a small gold bracelet, the kind given in maternity wards. The name etched into the metal read, Eleanor M. Davis, March 6th, 96L. Emma clutched it in her fist like a lifeline, not to the lie she'd lived, but to the girl who had existed before all the silence. Later that night, she sat with her laptop open and wrote an email to the address listed in Charles Davis's letter. Subject line, I think I'm ready. She didn't know what she'd say when they spoke. She only knew that somewhere a man had waited 30 years to hear her voice. And now, for the first time, she wanted to hear his. The call lasted 47 minutes. Emma had imagined it would be awkward, filled with silence or too many questions, but instead it felt strangely quiet, like a room that had been sealed for decades was finally aired out. Charles Davis had a deep, gentle voice and a hesitation that made him sound younger than his years. He didn't cry. Emma didn't either, but every word they exchanged felt like rain falling on a cracked field. He told her about Margaret, how she used to hum while brushing her hair, how she always ordered orange sherbet instead of ice cream, how she wrote poems in the margins of old books because she didn't trust journals. He spoke about holding Emma the day she was born, about the way her hand curled instinctively around his pinky finger, as if she knew him before words. He never blamed Catherine. Not once. She gave you a life, he said softly, even if it came from loss. Emma closed the laptop after the call and stared at the wall for a long time. On the windowsill, the gold bracelet gleamed beside the old photo of Margaret, smiling, pregnant, hopeful. The name etched into the metal no longer felt foreign. It felt reclaimed. She wasn't just Emma Price, daughter of Catherine. She was Eleanor Margaret Davis, daughter of a woman who had lived, loved, and been lost too soon, and she was both. Later that week, she drove 3 hours to a quiet cemetery just beyond the county line. The grave markers were simple, flat stones in neat rows, shaded by tall oaks. Margaret's was near the back, half covered by fallen leaves. Emma knelt and cleared them gently, tracing the engraved name with her fingers. "I found you." She placed 2 white lilies at the base of the headstone, one for Margaret, one for Lillian. "I wish I could hate her," she said aloud, "for what happened. But she was a child too, and maybe no one ever taught her how to hold the kind of pain she carried." Before leaving, she unfolded a small letter she'd written by hand and slid it beneath a stone at the grave's edge. "You didn't get to raise me, but I carry you anyway, in my voice, in my hands, in every question I've ever asked." She didn't go to Catherine's grave that day. She didn't need to. Some part of her believed that Catherine already knew, that maybe, in some quiet corner of whatever comes next, she was finally able to forgive herself. Back at home, Emma sat at her desk and opened a fresh notebook. On the top of the first page, she wrote, "For my daughter." Her own child, Lily, had just turned 18, smart, strong, too much like her mother in all the ways that scared her. Emma had never told her the full truth about her family, not yet. But now she would. She began writing everything, not just the facts, but the feelings, the fear, the confusion, the guilt, the wonder. She wrote about Margaret's laughter and Joan's silence, about the photo in the bookcase and the voice on the tape, about how love could fracture under grief, how names could be lost and found again, and how, sometimes, the only way to end a legacy of silence was to break it, out loud, on paper, in the open. When she finished, she tucked the letter inside a new hardcover copy of Rebecca and wrapped it in tissue paper. One day, she'd give it to Lily. Not as an explanation, but as an invitation to ask questions, to know more, to never be afraid of the messy, complicated stories that families carry. Weeks later, as spring finally arrived in full, Emma sat on the porch of her apartment and stared out at the blossoming dogwoods lining the street. She wore the bracelet every now and then, only at home, only when she needed to feel anchored to something older than herself. She had gone by Emma for most of her life, and she didn't plan to change that, but sometimes, when she spoke her full name aloud in the quiet, Eleanor Margaret Davis, it felt like all the pieces finally fit. She closed her eyes, tilted her head to the breeze, and whispered, "I know who I am now." And for the first time in her life, there was no voice in the back of her mind questioning whether that was true. Just silence. But not the kind born from hiding, the kind born from peace.